Well, the U.S. and Cuba have had the frostiest of relations since the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And at that revolution, the Cuban rebels overthrew a U.S.-supported president, Fulgencio Batista, who had allowed lucrative business interests for the American mafia. They controlled drug, gambling, and prostitution businesses in Havana. Also, many large U.S.-based multinationals were awarded lucrative contracts under his rule. And after more than 50 years of isolation by the United States, rapprochement was seen in December of 2014 under the leadership of U.S. President Barack Obama and the current Cuban President Raul Castro. Obama's visit is historic as it's the first by a U.S. president since Calvin Coolidge in 1928.
U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to Cuba is the first by an American president in 88 years. Cuba and the United States restored diplomatic relations on 20th July 2015. They had been severed in 1961 during the Cold War. The United States continues to maintain a commercial, economic and financial embargo, which makes it illegal for U.S. corporations to do business with Cuba. Obama has called for ending the embargo, but it requires congressional approval. In the 1820s, as a result of the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish rule until the Spanish-American War of 1898. Under the Treaty of Paris, Cuba became a U.S. protectorate and U.S. gained a position of economic and political dominance over the island. Though it formally became independent in 1902, U.S. influence continued until the Cuban Revolution of 1959. By 1926, U.S. companies owned 60% of the Cuban sugar industry and imported 95% of the total Cuban crop, as Washington supported successive Cuban governments even after the military overthrow by Cuban rebels in 1933. Until Castro, the U.S. was so overwhelmingly influential in Cuba that the American ambassador was the second most important man after the Cuban president. In 1961, the U.S. severed diplomatic ties with Cuba and began pursuing covert operations to topple Fidel Castro. The Cuban regime nationalized U.S. corporations, and the U.S. continued to impose sanctions as the Cold War progressed. President Kennedy had criticized the Eisenhower policy towards Cuba. He had said,
"We let Batista put the U.S. on the side of tyranny, and we did nothing to convince the people of Cuba and Latin America that we wanted to be on the side of freedom."
In 1961, Cuba resisted an armed invasion by about 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy assumed complete responsibility for the venture, and Castro used it to further boost his popularity. The subsequent plans of the U.S. to destabilize Castro became known as the Cuban Project. Post the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, domestic politics in both countries prevented closer ties with each other. However, under the presidency of Barack Obama and the change of guard following Fidel Castro's fading health and his brother Raul Castro at the helm, a thaw was in the offing. On 17 December 2014, the two leaders announced the beginning of a process of normalizing relations. Credit has also been given to the Vatican in arriving at an agreement to lift some U.S. travel restrictions, reduce restrictions on remittances, and allow U.S. banks to access the Cuban financial system. Obama's visit at the fag end of his presidency could pave a way for continuous engagement with Cuba and stronger ties with Latin America. Bureau Report, DD News.
And to put this historic visit into perspective, joining us in the studio are two well-known commentators on international affairs. Pramitpal Chaudhary is foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, and KP Nair is consulting editor with the Telegraph. We'll start with you, Pramitpal Chaudhary. Well, after 1898, there was a chance of Cuba becoming perhaps a U.S. state. Was that a possibility?
There had long been a debate in America that Cuba should be part of the United States. But the final real game was that in the U.S. Civil War, because it would have been part of the American South and therefore a slave-controlled state, the North rejected the idea of conquering Cuba. And at that point, after that, America really lost interest in direct conquests of various of other parts of Central America and the Caribbean, and preferred what I'd call indirect imperial control.
Okay.
Under the Monroe Doctrine that no great power in Europe should ever rule.
Sure.
Basically, it became difficult, should we say, for America to territorially expand because you had to change the Constitution and so on from the Civil War period onward. So Really, after that, other than Alaska and Hawaii, America ceased to territorially expand itself afterwards.
Right.
So it really became a question of indirect control over large portions of Latin America and the Caribbean. And the Caribbean obviously was seen as America's sort of backyard.
Yes.
And therefore Cuba, with being by far the largest single country in the Caribbean, was a source of major American interest and remains a source of American strategic interest ever since.
Mr. Nair, well, I mean, if with this indirect control, the U.S. Had supported various regimes in Cuba until the revolution, and under that there was the support for Batista, and well, that was he had a closeness to the mob, as that report suggested, and led to perhaps conditions for the revolution, one would say, isn't it?
Yes, that's true, but it's also a fact that at that time, in fact, even well after the Cuban Revolution, the United States considered all of the Caribbean and Latin America as its backyard, an extension of itself.
Okay.
And at that point of time, Cuba really was the only exception, you know. I mean, it's changed since then. They came Nicaragua, then of course Venezuela later, Bolivia, Ecuador, and in fact, while the rest of the world moved away from the left, from socialism and communism, in Latin America, the 90s and the 2000s
Right.
have been the exact opposite. You know, a number of regimes which were left-leaning came up.
Right.
But many of them, several of them have been discredited. Venezuela, for example. But Castro, the Castro government, the Castro setup has survived, and compared to the other left-leaning regimes
Sure.
in Latin America, the Cuban regime has had
survived.
credibility, and it has.
And why has that been the case, Pramit Pal Chaudhary? Because of the system of education in Cuba, or even though the Americans put all these sanctions on Cuba, you know, they seem to be reasonably happy living their lives in a sense, and or they have these iconic, or they treat these people as iconic leaders, Fidel Castro himself, Che Guevara, all these kind of people.
But Che wasn't Cuban,
But still, yeah.
But no, let's put it this way: the Cubans did, as you've mentioned, was as has been mentioned, was a unusual sort of strange socialist communist outpost in the middle of the Western Hemisphere. During the Cold War, they were successful in their, as you've mentioned, in terms of their social welfare programs, as were a lot of socialist communist regimes. But they were also massively supported by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union used to spend somewhere between $5 to $6 billion a year in subsidies to Cuba during the Cold War. And one of the reasons why the Cuban system began to slowly economically decline after the Cold War was the loss of those subsidies. They've continued to receive subsidies, largely from Venezuela, which provides about 100,000 barrels of oil, I think, every week or something, to sustain them. That continues, but their economy has essentially stagnated since then. So they have a very good welfare structure, but overall growth in the economy has remained has been essentially dead.
Sure.
Now since the end of the Cold War, which is one of the reasons why the Castro brothers, who well, Fidel Castro opposed reform, but his brother was a little more pragmatic about it, said we need to survive. But the regime has been effectively, as you've mentioned, done very well on the welfare side, so there's very clearly a degree of popularity on that front.
Okay.
They have positioned themselves as a nation under siege.
Sure.
From the United States, which has given them a degree of popular support.
Right.
A lot of their opposition also has fled. 2 million Cubans have left Cuba.
Okay.
And the bulk of those are anti-Castro or anti-communist regimes, which
Fair
is the
enough.
reason why that's all moved out of the country. But we should also mention it's a repressive regime. This is not a country that Amnesty International gives good reports to.
Sure.
They do practice repression.
Yes.
But they have a degree of political legitimacy, both from the sanctions itself, and the fact that they have accomplished a fair amount on the social side for their people.
And Mr. Nair, these 2 million people who have left Cuba, and many of them in the United States, many of them in Florida, all looking at perhaps at a possibility of, even though they are against the Castro regime. They're looking possibly at the better relations between the U.S. and Cuba for the future.
Not really.
Not really?
Not really, because the Cuban Americans, especially they're derisively known as the Florida Mafia. So they are completely against any rapprochement with Cuba until the Castro regime is removed. In fact, Bill Clinton, when he was president, there was this incident of the Cuban boy who came, Elian Gonzalez, and small boy, I think he was 6 years old. So the Cubans Miami Cubans wanted to keep him there, and his father wanted to take him back. And Bill Clinton became extremely unpopular with the Miami Cubans because he used force. The federal forces raided the boy's place and took him back and sent him back to Cuba.
So these are traditional positions, Mr. Nair, but under Raul Castro since 2008, things at least seem to be changing. There's more realism, and under President Obama too, there seems to be more realism. Could this group of people change their mind or change their opinions, or are they mostly Republican in their way of thinking?
No, I don't think they will change their mind. And their perennial hope is that Fidel Castro will die. Every time there is a bad health report about Fidel Castro, these people are on the streets dancing. But Fidel Castro seems to be like a cat with 9 lives, But let us face it, Obama did not do it out of any altruism. Obama's change of heart is actually an admission that U.S. policy towards Cuba since the 60s has failed.
All right. Well, the U.S. has Guantanamo Bay, isn't it, as part of an agreement. And I think since the regime, since the revolution, they actually haven't paid for the lease or something like that, or they haven't accepted the money of the lease.
Well, the Cuban government insists that, yes, this is an illegal base, so therefore they will not accept, because accepting money would effectively legitimize the American presence.
All right.
But the Americans say we have essentially at least till eternity on this issue. So yes, it's there. But the Cubans, theoretically, Cubans could assault it and capture it the same way they did Goa, but they don't, because it has its purposes for the Cubans as well. But yes, that is there.
And what are some of the issues then that exist between these two countries that could be sorted out in the future?
Well, I think fundamentally for Obama,
it's the removal of all these sanctions.
Yeah, well, Obama comes in from the liberal democratic point of view, which has long argued that even if you look at the American experience of the Soviet Union, it was when they opened up to the Soviet Union, in other words, they began to trade and work with a reformist regime, the Soviet Union collapsed. In other words, you expose it to oxygen, the mummy will slowly disintegrate. So their argument has always been that sanctions actually helps maintain the communist regime in Cuba. It doesn't stop it from moving. So there's one school that basically argues, even on the liberal side, that this is not a nice regime, we accept, but the real policy should be to open them up, not to close them, seal them off, because then they survive. And to some degree, Obama, I think, comes from that point of view.
All right.
But the other view is simply that what do you get out of sanctions? It just doesn't make any sense in the long run. And even the Cuban Americans, once they receive enough economic benefits because they're obviously the people who would be more likely to be able to invest in their relatives and so on, their point of view would also change over time.
We need to take a short commercial break. When we return, there's a lot more to discuss about what's on the table when President Obama is in Cuba. Stay with us.
बहुत बहुत बधाई हो, आपने अपने बच्चों को पोलियो से बचा लिया। लेकिन जब तक दुनिया में पोलियो का एक भी केस है, पोलियो का खतरा बना हुआ है। इसीलिए अब सरकार देश में पोलियो इंजेक्शन की शुरुआत कर रही है, ताकि आपके बच्चे को मिले डबल सुरक्षा। अब अपने 1 साल से छोटे बच्चे को टीकाकरण सत्र में पोलियो की तीसरी खुराक के साथ जरूर दिलवाएं पोलियो का इंजेक्शन। क्यों राधा, इससे क्या होगा पता है ना?
हाँ दीदी, पोलियो से डबल सुरक्षा हमेशा के लिए। याद रहे, पोलियो की तीसरी खुराक के साथ जरूर दिलवाएं पोलियो का इंजेक्शन।
अधिक जानकारी के लिए अपने पास के स्वास्थ्य केंद्र, एएनएम या आशा दीदी से संपर्क करें।
मैं अमिताभ बच्चन आज आपके सामने वो कहने जा रहा हूं जो मैंने पहले कभी नहीं कहा। मैं एक रोगी, हेपेटाइटिस बी का रोगी। 1982 में कुली फिल्म की शूटिंग के दौरान मेरे साथ एक दुर्घटना हुई। ऑपरेशन करवाना पड़ा और मेरे शरीर में 60 बोतल खून चढ़ाया गया। खून का कोई एक सैंपल हेपेटाइटिस बी इन्फेक्टेड था जो मेरे लिवर तक पहुंच गया। कई सालों बाद आम जांच के दौरान जब इसका पता चला तो मुझे यह भी पता चला कि मेरा 1/4 लिवर ही बचा हुआ है। लेकिन सही इलाज के बाद आज मैं आपके सामने खड़ा हूं और काम कर रहा हूं। हेपेटाइटिस बी से बचने का पहला उपाय है शिशु के जन्म पर पहला टीका लगवाएं और पहले साल में 3 और नियमित टीके लगवाएं। ये आपका पहला कदम होना चाहिए। मुफ्त टीकाकरण के लिए अपने पास के स्वास्थ्य केंद्र जाएं और पूरी जानकारी लें। देखिए, ये जो हेपेटाइटिस बी है, इससे हम डरेंगे नहीं, लड़ेंगे।
किशोर अवस्था हम सब की जिंदगी का बहुत ही अहम पड़ाव होता है, जिसमें हम सब बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण शारीरिक और मानसिक बदलावों से गुजरते हैं। इस उम्र में खून की कमी यानी अनीमिया काफी आम है, जिसके कारण कमजोरी, चिड़चिड़ापन और थकान जैसी शिकायतें आती हैं। सप्ताह में एक बार आईएफए की नीली गोली लेना किशोर अवस्था में विकास के लिए सहायक होता है। ये नीली गोली शासकीय शालाओं, आंगनबाड़ी केंद्रों और शासकीय स्वास्थ्य संस्थाओं में निशुल्क मिलती है। मैं आशा करती हूँ कि आप सब किशोर और किशोरियां साप्ताहिक आईएफए की इस नीली गोली का सेवन जरूर करेंगे।
एनआरआई लड़के से शादी हुई तो फैमिली में सब बहुत खुश हुए, लेकिन विदेश पहुंचकर मालूम पड़ा कि मेरे हस्बैंड ने शादी के लिए सब झूठ बोला था। काम काज से लेकर प्रॉपर्टी तक के बारे में सब इन्फॉर्मेशन गलत थी। मेरे साथ उसका बर्ताव दिन पर दिन खराब होता गया, मारपीट, मेंटल टॉर्चर। और जब पता चला कि वो पहले से ही शादीशुदा है तो मैं बिल्कुल टूट गई। विदेश में रहते हुए उसके चंगुल से निकलना मेरे लिए मुश्किल था।
एनआरआई लड़के से शादी तय करने से पहले उसका एम्प्लॉयमेंट रिकॉर्ड, सोशल सिक्योरिटी नंबर, पासपोर्ट डिटेल्स और मैरिटल स्टेटस के बारे में अच्छी तरह से जान लेना बहुत ही जरूरी है। और ध्यान रखें, एनआरआई शादी को भारत में ही कानूनन दर्ज करवाएं। गलत एनआरआई शादी में फंस चुकी कोई भी महिला तुरंत मदद के लिए पुलिस और एम्बेसी में संपर्क कर सकती है। और साथ ही राष्ट्रीय महिला आयोग की वेबसाइट पर जाकर एनआरआई सेल में ऑनलाइन कंप्लेंट भी रजिस्टर कर सकती है।
किशोर अवस्था हम सब की जिंदगी का बहुत ही अहम पड़ाव होता है, जिसमें हम सब बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण शारीरिक और मानसिक बदलावों से गुजरते हैं। इस उम्र में खून की कमी यानी अनीमिया काफी आम है, जिसके कारण कमजोरी, चिड़चिड़ापन और थकान जैसी शिकायतें आती हैं। सप्ताह में एक बार आईएफए की नीली गोली लेना किशोर अवस्था में विकास के लिए सहायक होता है। ये नीली गोली शासकीय शालाओं, आंगनबाड़ी केंद्रों और शासकीय स्वास्थ्य संस्थाओं में निशुल्क मिलती है। मैं आशा करती हूँ कि आप सब किशोर और किशोरियां साप्ताहिक आईएफए की इस नीली गोली का सेवन जरूर करेंगे।
आज मेरा एग्जाम है।
अच्छा होगा डेविड, गुड लक।
आज रिजल्ट आएगा।
बेस्ट ऑफ लक।
इस बार क्लास में फर्स्ट आया है डेविड और सेकंड आई है रिया, थर्ड है असलम।
कांग्रेट्स। पर अब क्या हुआ डेविड?
मुझे आगे पढ़ना है, पर पापा कहते हैं पैसे नहीं है।
पैसे नहीं है? वो देखो,
प्री मैट्रिक स्कॉलरशिप स्कीम।
प्री मैट्रिक स्कॉलरशिप अल्पसंख्यक समुदाय के उन बच्चों के लिए है जिनकी सालाना पारिवारिक आय 1 लाख रुपए से कम है और जिन्होंने पिछली कक्षाओं में 50% अंक प्राप्त किए हैं। और लड़कियों के लिए 30% स्कॉलरशिप निर्धारित है। अधिक जानकारी के लिए लॉगिन करें www.minorityAffairs.gov.in पर या कॉल करें टोल फ्री नंबर 1800112001 पर। सबका साथ, सबका विकास।
Welcome back. We are discussing the U.S. President Barack Obama's visit to Cuba with K.P. Nair, consulting editor of The Telegraph, and Pramod Pal Chowdhury, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. Mr. Nair, before the break, we were trying to understand what's really on the table during this visit. And one report suggests that Obama is looking for Cuba to bring in a lot of economic reforms that can transform the economy and help in that way. Now, last year itself, another report suggests that Raul Castro had brought in some reforms, and 496,000 small businesses were given licenses, and a lot of them were run by young people. And so young people, seem to be at the forefront. How would you understand all this?
See, I want to very briefly go back to your question about Guantanamo Bay. See, Guantanamo is controlled by the United States under an agreement of 1903. Yes. But the original agreement was for using it as a coaling station, allowing for visits by naval ships. Not as a naval base, but visits by naval ship. Instead, what has come of it, it has been converted into a prison. And
yes.
what kind of prison?
That's
I mean, people are held without any charge. So much so, it is such a notorious prison that President Obama is committed to closing it. So
yes.
the situation is such that you let out your house on rent and for residential purposes, and the tenant uses it for trading in drugs, you see. So that is the problem with Guantanamo.
Sure, but that has happened over years, yes. But let's come back to the point.
At the moment, yes. So in my opinion, a lot of the things surrounding President Obama's visit is meant for us, for journalists, you know, to say that this is the first visit in 88 years by
which is all
US
being said.
president.
That's what.
So there is more drama than substance.
I see.
First of all, we must understand that this is not the first meeting between Obama and
That's
President
true. They
Raul
have met.
Castro.
This is the
They
third,
met
in fact.
last year in September, where substantive issues were discussed away from the media glare in closed doors.
Right.
And the real work of improving US-Cuba relations is being done by what has been created, what is called as a binational commission.
Sure.
No, on the American side, everybody has made it clear that although there is a thaw, this is going to be a long process. So it is a very good idea to create this binational commission which will deal with the nitty-gritty. But whereas President Obama's visit, we will see that it's a scripted thing. You know, for example, today the women in white, the dissidents, they demonstrated, they were arrested. President Obama's statement at the embassy was followed a script, you know.
Fair enough.
So in substantive terms, I don't expect much out of the visit. But the thaw will go on elsewhere.
Mr. Pramod Pal Chowdhury, the fact that Cuba has been isolated, the Americans have been trying to influence Cuban public opinion through radio, Spanish radio, for quite some time. I don't know how popular that was in Cuba. There's no real test of it. But Cuba seems to be, stuck, let's say, about 50 years behind. At least it appears to be, according to reports.
It does look
it's
like that,
it's quaint, and a lot of tourist attraction as a result of that, maybe, or for other reasons as well. How do you understand all this, and how is it going to change with the Americans and the Cubans now beginning to become
Well, it's going to be
warmer?
interesting because, as I mentioned, Castro, partly by forced isolation, to some degree, can arguably have helped maintain his regime. If you're a hermit kingdom, it's so much easier to control what's been happening. And so only less than 5% of Cubans have internet access by government regulation. And the internet access is pathetic. It's 1 MB, so it's almost useless. So therefore, you have a situation where the government, as most communist regimes do, has a very tight control on both media and on what you say public communication. So you'll have a situation where for Raul Castro, the challenge is going to be as he begins to open up the economy, and then as the sanctions are slowly lifted and more external influences are allowed in the island, will he be able to sustain a one-party regime? I don't see any serious challenge over the next 10 years, but in the future, that's going to be an issue.
Right. Mr. Nair, there's a quotation that's being attributed to Fidel Castro in 1973 that seems prophetic. It's on Twitter, and it says, according to him, he says, the US will come to talk with us when they have a black president and the world has a Latin American pope. I mean, it's I don't know how true that is, but that's what's happened.
Well, I am hearing this
for the first
quotation
time.
for the first time. But it is true that Americans have an empathy for the black president, you know.
Yes.
Because if you take Latin America, all of Latin America, the racial divisions are very sharp. You know, whites are known as gringos, and the racial discrimination all over Latin America is very intense, except in Cuba. Cuba is a place where there has been complete racial harmony, partly because of the communist regime, but also because of Cuba's history. So they have a special psychological relationship with Michelle and Barack Obama. And I think that it is because of that the president took Sasha and Malia, his daughters, who are the rage everywhere now. You know, they have grown up compared to what they were when he entered the White House.
Another analyst, Mr. Pramod Pal Chaudhary, and these are your final comments I'm going to ask you, says that Cuban people are not going to be bewitched by America and American culture because the Cuban culture is pretty strong. Would that be the case with the whole of Latin America to some extent? Or because, I mean, well, all those who move over to the US, I mean, in the Hispanic form, enter into America and sort of accept American culture or become Americanized?
Well, let's put it this way. It's not culture, I think, that I would argue that attracts them. It's been purely economics. The single largest Hispanic population obviously has been the Mexicans, and they have gone there largely for economic reasons. For example, when America's economy began to go into recession over the past few years, the number of Mexicans leaving the United States actually exceeded those going in. So I don't think it's a cultural issue. It'll be the economic factor that matters, and America's may not be doing well, but it's still doing better than Cuba is per capita.
Final words from you, Mr. Nair?
When you talk of American culture, that itself is a question mark.
It's the US culture I'm talking about,
It's like what Gandhiji said about Western civilization. It's a good idea.
All right, we leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us on this special discussion. Well, while many sanctions continue and the Republicans make much less they make a much less of this welcome that the U.S. President Barack Obama received. They think it's not a grand welcome. In fact, Donald Trump made a point of that. He said that, you know, when the Pope visited, Raul Castro himself went to greet the Pope, but that was not the case with the U.S. President. During this historic visit, this visit will encourage greater cooperation between the United States and Cuba. And already many Cubans are benefiting from the relaxation of travel restrictions because Americans are visiting Cuba, and now it's a trickle, but it will become a flood, and tourism will lead to other economic activities and opportunities. Cuban President Raul Castro has promised reforms to encourage entrepreneurship, and last year itself, as we did mention, 496,000 licenses for small businesses were granted. However, the Chinese news agency Xinhua, it has said that the ultimate rapprochement with Cuba requires the United States to refrain from imposing its ideology on others and to treat others as equals. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us. Namaskar.